In the pre-dawn hours of December 16th, 1944, along the German-Belgian border near Monschau, a critical moment approached that would reshape the final months of the war. Colonel Oskar Alfred Axelson stood among classified ammunition crates at 0531 hours, confronting a decision that would directly contradict orders from the highest echelons of Allied leadership. His field glasses revealed German forces assembling for what would become Hitler's final major offensive campaign in the Western Theater, the operation Germans called Watch on the Rhine. The 38th Cavalry Squadron held defensive positions on the northern shoulder of what military historians would later designate the Battle of the Bulge, and they were about to face overwhelming enemy strength. The operations officer delivered his report with measured urgency. German artillery preparation had begun, and the 38th was calling for immediate fire support. Axelson's attention turned to the shell stacks bearing the classified designation T-98 POSIT, proximity-fused ammunition that had been absolutely prohibited for land deployment since its creation. This technology operated at such extreme secrecy levels that most American commanders remained unaware it even existed. Inside each shell sat a miniaturized radio transmitter designed to trigger detonation at precisely 30 feet above the ground, generating a lethal cone of metal fragments that rendered traditional foxhole protection completely ineffective. The colonel issued his order to load the VT shells, using the variable timecode designation intended to mislead enemy intelligence efforts. They would require everything available. Within 47 minutes, this unauthorized choice would expose German ground forces to weaponry that would fundamentally alter the war's remaining months. The shells preparing for deployment contained technology so advanced that German scientists had categorically declared such devices impossible to create. Each represented an industrial accomplishment, demonstrating the genuine technological and manufacturing gap between American production capabilities and German assumptions about their adversary. The mathematics governing battlefield lethality was undergoing revolutionary transformation. Each shell would detonate at approximately 30 feet altitude, producing a cone of supersonic steel fragments moving at 3,000 feet per second, saturating a 60-yard radius with deadly effect. The depth of excavation, the protection of foxholes, the thickness of overhead cover that combat troops could construct under battlefield conditions. None of these traditional defensive measures would provide meaningful protection against this descending storm of metal fragments. Official U.S. military assessments ranked the proximity fuse as the third most significant technological achievement of the entire war, exceeded only by radar and atomic weapons. Unlike those developments, however, its existence remained completely unknown to German forces until the moment they experienced its effects. The underlying concept was elegantly straightforward, while the execution demanded impossible complexity. A miniature radio transmitter and receiver, compact enough to fit within an artillery shell nose, robust enough to endure acceleration forces reaching 20,000 times gravity, sophisticated enough to measure its distance from the ground, and detonate at optimal height for maximum lethality. 4 vacuum tubes, not the 5 sometimes incorrectly reported, comprised each fuse, forming a complete radio station compressed into a space smaller than a coffee cup, hardened to survive forces that would liquefy human tissue. Development had commenced in 1940, consuming resources equivalent to $1 billion in period currency, approximately $15 billion in modern values. By late 1943, American manufacturing facilities were generating 40,000 proximity fuses each day, production rates that would eventually reach 70,000 daily by war's conclusion. The British scientific mission, witnessing the technology firsthand, described it as warfare's most remarkable scientific accomplishment. Production statistics revealed American industrial dominance with stark clarity. Exactly 22,073,481 proximity fuses manufactured between 1942 and 1945, with 21,630,385 shipped for combat deployment and 388,324 utilized for testing purposes. Each fuse incorporated approximately 130 components manufactured to tolerances measuring 1/1,000,000th of an inch, assembled in controlled, clean room environments by 110,000 workers who frequently didn't understand what they were building. The power generation challenge had been solved through ingenious wind-driven generator design that activated only after shell departure from the barrel. A small propeller, protected during acceleration, extended into the airstream, generating electricity to charge capacitors powering the radio circuit, operating at 180 to 220 megahertz frequencies. This meant the fuse remained completely inert until fired, safe for handling, impossible to detect, immune to jamming attempts until the final flight seconds. The initial massive deployment of proximity fused shells against ground targets commenced at 6:18 hours on December 16, 1944, precisely 47 minutes after the German offensive began. Colonel Axelson's 406th Artillery Group fired without official authorization, responding to immediate tactical emergency. General Eisenhower wouldn't formally request clearance until December 19th. With complete restriction removal by December 21st. The impact was both immediate and catastrophic. German soldiers advancing through pre-dawn darkness dove into their prepared foxholes when American artillery commenced, executing standard procedure they had performed countless times previously. But the shells exploded in the air above them rather than impacting the ground. Fragments descended straight downward at angles that made foxholes useless. The 99th Infantry Division's after-action report documented the result. VT fused concentrations on German assembly areas near Krinkelt produced extraordinary casualties among lead battalions within 12 minutes of fire mission commencement. Enemy medical services were overwhelmed. Advancing units were compelled to step over their own dead to maintain the attack. By December 23rd, military intelligence estimated 2,000 German soldiers had been killed by proximity-fused rounds during fighting around Malmedy, where artillery battalions fired with devastating effect against SS forces. Some attackers reportedly became so unnerved they charged directly into artillery fire, yelling surrender. The psychological impact surpassed even the physical destruction. Understanding why proximity fuses made traditional defensive positions obsolete requires examining the physics of airburst devastation. A standard high-explosive shell detonating on ground contact sends 50% of fragments into the earth, 45% outward in horizontal pattern, and only 5% upward. A soldier in properly constructed foxhole had 90% survival probability from conventional artillery. The proximity fuse transformed these calculations catastrophically. Detonating at 30 feet altitude, 100% of fragments traveled downward or outward in inverted cone pattern. The lethal radius expanded from 25 yards for ground burst to 60 yards for airburst. More critically, fragments arrived at 30 to 45-degree angles, perfectly aligned to enter foxholes, trenches, and rifle pits. The lethal fragment area increased from 60 square feet with conventional fuses to 3,000 square feet, a 50-fold improvement rendering traditional field fortifications largely ineffective. This wasn't merely incremental improvement in artillery effectiveness. It represented fundamental transformation of how artillery could be employed against infantry forces. The shells themselves stood as monuments to American precision manufacturing. The miniaturized components had to function after experiencing forces that would destroy conventional electronics. The 4 vacuum tubes, a triode for oscillator and detector functions, a pentode for amplification, a thyrotron as trigger switch, and occasionally a diode for rectification, were specially hardened versions bearing no resemblance to commercial counterparts. Proximity fuse development represented American scientific and industrial cooperation at its peak. In August 1940, the British TISAD mission had shared their military secrets with America, including early radar work and theoretical proximity fuse concepts. British scientists had proven theory but lacked industrial capacity for device development and mass production. The National Defense Research Committee, formed in June 1940, made proximity fuse development their second priority after radar. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory became the development center, while American industry prepared for production. The challenges were staggering. The fuse had to withstand 20,000 Gs of acceleration, function in temperatures from -50 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit, spin at up to 30,000 RPM, and operate reliably after months of storage in conditions ranging from humid Pacific islands to frozen European depots. Section T, the code name for the Proximity Fuse project, employed 3,000 scientists and engineers at peak. They developed new plastics that wouldn't shatter under acceleration, miniature vacuum tubes that could withstand forces destroying normal electronics, and assembly techniques achieving accuracy measured in 10,000ths of an inch. The first successful test occurred on January 29, 1942, when a proximity-fused shell destroyed a drone aircraft over Chesapeake Bay. By August 1942, the USS Cleveland was equipped with proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. Results were spectacular. Japanese aircraft kills increased dramatically. The USS Helena made history on January 5, 1943, shooting down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal using only 4 proximity-fused shells. But the technology was deemed too secret for land use, where enemy might recover unexploded shells. This restriction held until the German offensive in the Ardennes threatened to split Allied forces, compelling field commanders like Colonel Axelson to make unauthorized decisions that would prove correct. Before ground deployment, proximity fuses had already proven revolutionary in naval warfare. Operating at sea eliminated enemy capture risk, allowing unrestricted use against Japanese aircraft. The statistics were compelling. Ships using proximity fuses required an average of 310 rounds per aircraft kill, compared to 1,162 rounds for conventional ammunition. By 1944, proximity fuse shells accounted for 25% of ammunition fired, but 51% of aircraft destroyed. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, proximity fuses helped create what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, with Japanese aircraft losses exceeding 400 planes. The technology that would devastate German infantry had been perfected against Japanese pilots. The British had begun using proximity fuses against V-1 flying bombs on June 12, 1944, just days after D-Day. Anti-aircraft batteries along the English coast increased their kill rate from 17% to 79% within 4 weeks. General Sir Frederick Pyle, commander of Anti-Aircraft Command, called it the most remarkable scientific achievement in warfare history. These successes made the restriction on ground use increasingly difficult to maintain. Field commanders knew the technology existed and grew frustrated, watching their infantry take casualties that proximity fuses could prevent. The Battle of the Bulge crisis finally broke this bureaucratic barrier. German intelligence had actually received warnings about proximity fuses. In October 1944, General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring's staff noticed dramatic increases in Luftwaffe losses to Allied anti-aircraft fire. They recovered metal fragments with unusual scoring patterns suggesting airburst detonation. Kesselring's report to OKW stated that evidence suggests Americans possess altitude-triggered ammunition, and if adapted to ground artillery, effects on infantry would be catastrophic. He recommended immediate investigation of countermeasures. The response from Berlin, found in captured archives, dismissed his concerns. Technical evaluation concluded proximity detonation under battlefield conditions was impossible. American anti-aircraft improvements were attributed to radar direction and increased gun density. No action was required. This dismissal would cost the Wehrmacht dearly. German scientists had actually attempted to develop proximity fuses since the early 1930s, creating 30 to 50 different designs, including acoustic fuses triggered by engine sound, electrostatic field devices, and radio-based systems. None reached operational status. Hitler's 1940 directive, terminating all development that couldn't reach production within 6 months, effectively killed their program. The irony was profound. During the Battle of the Bulge, German forces captured approximately 20,000 proximity fuses but never recognized what they had. German engineers had concluded such technology was impossible due to massive acceleration forces during firing. They literally held the intelligence coup of the war in their hands without realizing it. 5 American companies conducted final assembly. Crosley Corporation's Cincinnati plant employed 8,000 workers, producing up to 16,500 proximity fuses daily at peak production. Their quality control detected defects measuring 1/50,000th of an inch. The plant consumed more electricity daily than entire German cities. Air conditioning maintained temperature within 2 degrees to prevent thermal expansion affecting tolerances. Quality control rejected 28% of completed units that failed to meet specifications. This rejection rate, which would have been catastrophic in German production, was acceptable to American planners because production volume was so massive. They could afford to destroy more precision components daily than Germany produced monthly. Sylvania dominated component manufacturing, producing 95% of miniature vacuum tubes, over 100 million total, employing 10,000 workers across 15 plants dedicated solely to the VT program. Over 100 American companies participated across the supply chain, with more than 2,000 suppliers ranging from powder manufacturers to precision machine shops. The workforce was predominantly female. At Sylvania's Ipswich plant, 9,000 of 10,000 workers were women, many recruited from local communities. They worked in clean rooms with filtered air, using microscopes to verify component placement within tolerances of 0.02 of an inch. Each worker typically performed one specific task, repeated thousands of times per shift. By Christmas Day 1944, General George Patton assessed that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. This from a commander who had previously favored tanks and mobile warfare over artillery. The psychological impact on German forces was documented through prisoner interrogations. Captured soldiers repeatedly described feeling helpless against artillery that exploded overhead. Traditional defensive training emphasized taking cover in depressions, foxholes, or trenches. Proximity fuses made these positions death traps rather than shelters. One captured German officer told interrogators that American shells explode exactly at treetop height, always the same height. They tried everything: deeper holes, concrete covers, dispersal. Nothing worked. The consistency of the 30-foot detonation height, achieved through precise radio measurement, created a predictability that was paradoxically more terrifying than random impacts. The Hurtgen Forest Battle, which had raged since September 1944, transformed when proximity fuses were authorized for use on December 18th. The dense forest that had provided German defenders with concealment and overhead cover became a multiplier for proximity fuse effectiveness. Tree bursts had always been deadly, but they were difficult to achieve deliberately with time-fused shells. Proximity fuses detonated consistently at optimal height, whether over open ground or forest canopy. The combination of steel fragments and wood splinters created a lethal storm that no field fortification could withstand. The 4th Infantry Division's artillery fired 12,000 proximity-fused rounds in the first 48 hours after authorization. The division's after-action report noted dramatic increase in enemy casualties and corresponding decrease in German defensive effectiveness. Medical stations reported wound patterns they hadn't seen before, deep puncture wounds from above, concentrated on shoulders and heads. This battle became a grim laboratory for understanding proximity fuse effects. Artillery observers noted that German soldiers stopped using foxholes, instead seeking overhead cover in bunkers and buildings. This forced them into concentrated positions that became targets for conventional high-explosive shells, creating a tactical dilemma with no good solution. Operation Grenade, the Allied offensive to reach the Rhine, began February 23, 1945. The Ninth Army fired hundreds of thousands of proximity-fused shells in the first week. German defensive positions, carefully prepared over months, proved vulnerable to airburst attack. The Wehrmacht issued increasingly desperate directives attempting to counter proximity fuses. A February 10th order required all units to construct foxholes minimum 5 meters deep with overhead cover of logs, minimum 30 centimeters diameter, covered with 50 centimeters of earth. The February 18th revision mandated movement in areas under artillery threat only through covered trenches. All positions must have concrete or steel overhead protection. These measures were physically impossible under combat conditions. The materials and time required for such construction didn't exist. A February 26th directive simply stated units will disperse to maximum distance combat effectiveness permits, no more than 2 men in any position. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, captured on March 7, 1945, illustrated both the power and limitations of proximity fuses. When Lieutenant Karl Timmermann requested artillery support with VT fuses to slow German retreat across the bridge, the artillery commander refused, citing reports that US troops were too close. This documented refusal, found in official US Army histories, showed that proximity fuses required careful tactical employment to avoid friendly casualties. German attempts to develop their own proximity fuse revealed the true industrial gap between the combatants. Rheinmetall resumed research in 1944 and actually test-fired several hundred working prototypes before war's end. But prototypes weren't production models. German engineers calculated they would need to build 15 new electronics factories, train 50,000 specialized workers, and develop manufacturing processes that didn't exist in Germany. They would need 500 tons of refined copper monthly, 50 tons of silver for contacts, and 100,000 skilled workers just to approach American production rates. Even if materials existed, German industry lacked the precision machine tools required. American factories used Swiss-made microlathes, accurate to 1/10,000th of an inch. Germany's best machine tools, worn from 5 years of continuous operation, achieved 1,000th inch accuracy on good days. The quality control requirements alone exceeded German capabilities. The deeper irony was that German scientists understood the theory perfectly. They had actually begun proximity fuse research before the Americans. But understanding theory and achieving mass production were entirely different challenges. America had not just developed superior technology, but created an industrial ecosystem capable of producing it in millions. While proximity fuses transformed ground warfare in Europe, their original purpose, anti-aircraft defense, reached peak effectiveness in the Pacific. By 1945, Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells destroyed Japanese aircraft with unprecedented efficiency. The kamikaze threat, which might have made invasion of Japan catastrophically costly, was largely neutralized by VT fuses. Ships using proximity fuses during the Okinawa campaign shot down 91 Japanese aircraft for every 100 attacking, compared to 25 per 100 before proximity fuses. Admiral Willis Lee stated that proximity fuses saved 100,000 American lives in the Pacific. Every Japanese plane shot down by VT fuses was one that didn't crash into American ships. This dual application, devastating against ground forces in Europe, decisive against aircraft in the Pacific, demonstrated American industrial philosophy: mass-produce excellence and deploy it everywhere. Germany, struggling to produce basic ammunition, faced an enemy that put sophisticated electronics in disposable shells. Military researchers studying proximity fuse effectiveness found they were 3 to 10 times more lethal than conventional artillery against ground targets. Against V-1 flying bombs, destruction rates increased from 24% to 79%. In naval anti-aircraft use, average rounds per kill dropped from over 1,000 to approximately 300. The 50-fold increase in lethal fragment area fundamentally changed artillery employment. Traditional artillery required concentrated barrages to achieve area coverage. Proximity fuses allowed dispersed fire to achieve similar effects with fewer shells. This improved logistics, reduced barrel wear, and allowed artillery to support more units simultaneously. General Patton reported that proximity fuses allowed his artillery to support advancing units more effectively. Instead of lengthy preparatory bombardments, artillery could fire shorter, more lethal concentrations that allowed infantry to advance before enemies recovered. This increased operational tempo contributed to rapid Allied advances in 1945. However, casualty figures require careful analysis. While various estimates circulated during and after the war, no documented evidence supports claims of specific large numbers of German deaths from proximity fuses. What is documented is their multiplication of artillery effectiveness and their psychological impact on German forces. German recognition of proximity fuse technology came gradually and incompletely. Prisoner interrogations revealed that most German soldiers never understood what was killing them. They spoke of tree bursts and air mines, but didn't grasp the systematic nature of the technology. German technical intelligence eventually recognized the sophistication involved. A March 1945 intelligence report stated that American artillery employing proximity detonation has inflicted casualties exceeding all other weapon systems combined since December 1944. Countermeasures have proven ineffective. Recommend immediate cessation of hostilities to preserve remaining forces from annihilation by superior technology. The proximity fuse program represented approximately 3% of all American physicists working on a single weapons project. This concentration of scientific talent combined with industrial capacity created production statistics that defied German comprehension. Each production line at Crosley Corporation could assemble 500 units per hour. Workers performed individual operations in seconds with microscopic precision, thousands of times per shift. The facilities operated 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. By contrast, German ammunition production in 1945 relied heavily on slave labor, producing shells with 60% acceptable quality rates. Sabotage by forced workers reduced effective output further. By March 1945, only 30% of German artillery shells functioned properly. American VT fuses achieved 94% reliability despite their sophisticated electronics. The proximity fuse story encompasses more than technology and production statistics. It fundamentally changed the battlefield experience for infantry on both sides. American soldiers gained confidence knowing their artillery could effectively suppress dug-in enemies. German soldiers lost the psychological security that earthen entrenchments had provided for centuries. Veterans' accounts from both sides confirm this transformation. American forward observers described calling in fire missions with new confidence, knowing proximity fuses would affect enemies even in prepared positions. German veterans recalled the helplessness of hearing incoming artillery and knowing that taking cover offered no protection. The medical implications were significant. Proximity fuse casualties presented unique challenges. The downward angle of fragments created wound patterns military surgeons hadn't encountered. German medical services, already strained, couldn't adapt to these new casualty patterns. American medical personnel, by contrast, had penicillin and plasma, advantages that had nothing to do with proximity fuses, but compounded their effectiveness. The proximity fuse represented more than tactical advantage. It demonstrated systemic superiority in connecting science, industry, and military application. While Germany pursued wonder weapons like V-2 rockets that consumed enormous resources for minimal military effect, America mass-produced genuinely revolutionary technology and deployed it widely. The German V-2 program cost approximately $2 billion in equivalent resources and killed approximately 9,000 people. The proximity fuse program cost half as much and transformed both ground and anti-aircraft warfare. This comparison illustrates different approaches to military technology. German emphasis on revolutionary platforms versus American focus on evolutionary improvements manufactured at scale. The proximity fuse also validated American organizational methods. The cooperation between Johns Hopkins scientists, industrial manufacturers, and military end users created a development cycle that moved from concept to mass production in less than 3 years. Germany's fragmented research efforts and inter-service rivalries prevented similar achievement. After Germany's surrender, American technical intelligence teams studied German proximity fuse research. They found sophisticated theoretical work, but no path to production. German scientists understood the principles, but couldn't overcome manufacturing challenges. The Rheinmetall prototypes, discovered in 1945, were technically sound, but used conventional vacuum tubes that couldn't survive artillery acceleration. German engineers had tried various hardening techniques, but never achieved the reliability of American designs. Even if they had, Germany lacked industrial capacity for mass production. Soviet forces received limited proximity fuse supplies through Lend-Lease, but no technical documentation. Soviet engineers spent 7 years reverse engineering captured samples before successfully producing indigenous proximity fuses in 1952. Even then, quality remained inferior to American wartime production. This technological transfer pattern revealed the complexity of proximity fuse manufacturing. Having examples wasn't enough. Successful production required industrial infrastructure, quality control systems, and manufacturing expertise that took years to develop. The proximity fuse story offers enduring lessons about military innovation. First, evolutionary improvements to existing systems can be more decisive than revolutionary new weapons. Proximity fuses were still artillery shells, but they transformed artillery effectiveness. Second, mass production capability matters as much as technological sophistication. Germany developed jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and advanced submarines, but couldn't manufacture them in decisive quantities. America produced millions of proximity fuses, each one a sophisticated electronic device, and treated them as expendable ammunition. Third, industrial integration determines military capability. The proximity fuse required coordinated effort from scientists, engineers, manufacturers, and military users. American organizational culture facilitated this integration. German institutional rivalries prevented it. Finally, secrecy has operational value, but also costs. Restricting proximity fuse use until December 1944 preserved tactical surprise, but meant months of additional Allied casualties that might have been prevented. The balance between security and operational advantage remains a challenge in modern military technology. The proximity fuse raises complex moral questions about technological warfare. It made killing more efficient, more certain, more mathematically precise. German soldiers in foxholes had no defense against shells detonating overhead at precisely calculated heights. This wasn't combat in any traditional sense, it was industrial slaughter. Yet proximity fuses also shortened the war. Every German division destroyed by proximity fused artillery was one less defending concentration camps. The technology that efficiently killed German soldiers also hastened the liberation of Nazi victims. Admiral Louis Strauss, who ranked proximity fuses among developments upon which victory very largely depended, understood this moral complexity. American veterans wrestled with these implications. They were grateful for technology that saved American lives, but troubled by its devastating effectiveness. Accounts describe finding German positions where every soldier died simultaneously from airburst fragments, efficient killing that removed human agency from death. The proximity fuse ultimately represented American advantages that transcended any single weapon. It demonstrated industrial capacity that could mass-produce sophistication, scientific capability that could solve complex problems quickly, and organizational ability to coordinate development and production. When German infantry faced proximity-fused artillery in December 1944, they confronted more than a new weapon. They faced the physical manifestation of American industrial democracy, a system that could conceive, develop, manufacture, and deploy revolutionary technology while simultaneously fighting a global war. The 30 feet between shell detonation and ground impact represented the gap between American capability and German assumptions. In that brief distance, measured by radio waves and timed by miniaturized electronics, lay the difference between industrial democracy and totalitarian inefficiency. The proximity fuse transformed more than World War II. It initiated the age of smart weapons. Modern precision-guided munitions trace their lineage to the miniaturized electronics first deployed in proximity fuses. The concept of putting intelligence into ammunition, revolutionary in 1944, is now standard military practice. The manufacturing techniques developed for proximity fuses influenced post-war electronics production. The quality control standards, clean room procedures, and precision assembly methods became foundational for the semiconductor industry. The women who assembled proximity fuses in 1944 pioneered techniques still used in electronics manufacturing. The organizational lessons proved equally enduring. The integration of academic research, industrial production, and military application became the model for Cold War weapons development. The proximity fuse program demonstrated that democratic societies could mobilize technology as effectively as totalitarian states, perhaps more so. This account relies on verified historical sources and documented evidence. Production figures come from Bureau of Ordnance records. Technical specifications derive from declassified Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory documents. Battle accounts are drawn from official after-action reports and military histories. Claims lacking documentation have been excluded. No evidence supports specific casualty figures sometimes attributed to proximity fuses. German jamming attempts remain unverified. Some frequently repeated accounts appear to be composite narratives rather than documented events. What remains after careful verification is still remarkable. The proximity fuse was genuinely revolutionary, transforming artillery from area weapon to precision system. Its development and mass production demonstrated American industrial supremacy. Its employment hastened Allied victory. At 30 feet altitude, democracy defeated fascism, not through superior ideology alone, though America possessed moral advantage, but through the mundane excellence of mass production. The proximity fuse, miniaturized electronics in an artillery shell, represented everything Nazi Germany had miscalculated about American democracy. Where Germany saw weakness in diversity, America found strength in mobilization. Jewish scientists who fled Nazi persecution contributed to proximity fuse development. Women who couldn't serve in combat assembled the weapons that killed German soldiers. Democratic inefficiency somehow produced 22 million sophisticated electronic devices, while totalitarian efficiency couldn't manufacture basic ammunition reliably. The German infantry who faced proximity-fused artillery in December 1944 were arguably the world's finest soldiers. They had conquered most of Europe, fought on multiple fronts, survived years of combat. They died in their foxholes not from lack of courage, but from encountering the future. They had 30 feet, the distance from airburst to impact, to recognize that everything they believed about American weakness was wrong. In those fractions of seconds between electronic detonation and impact on human flesh, the Third Reich's delusions met American reality. The proximity fuse killed more than German soldiers. It killed the mythology of martial superiority, the romance of defensive fortification, the concept that courage could overcome technology. In 30 feet of altitude, measured by miniature radios using technology that shouldn't have existed, produced in quantities that shouldn't have been achievable, America announced that future warfare belonged to those who could imagine it, engineer it, and mass-produce it. Every German soldier who died under proximity fuse airburst died from American industrial philosophy made manifest, not in ideology, but in engineering, not in propaganda, but in production, not in theory, but in terminal ballistics. The shells that exploded 30 feet above German foxholes delivered democracy's argument against fascism in fragments, proving that free societies could outproduce, out-innovate, and ultimately outfight totalitarian powers. The proximity fuse was ultimately democracy's perfect weapon, sophisticated yet mass-produced, complex yet reliable, expensive yet expendable. It killed efficiently not through hatred, but through engineering excellence. It ended battles not through barbarism, but through mathematics. It won wars not through cruelty, but through industrial capability. The story of German infantry facing proximity fuses is fundamentally about the collision between past and future. Traditional defensive techniques perfected over centuries became obsolete in minutes. The earth that had protected soldiers since warfare began could no longer shelter them. The proximity fuse didn't just kill German soldiers, it killed an entire conception of warfare. In December 1944, German infantry had 30 feet before proximity fuse airbursts shredded their foxholes. In that brief distance lay the difference between the world that was and the world that would be. They measured their graves in meters. America measured victory in megahertz. The future had arrived. It was mass-produced, and it exploded at exactly 30 feet.